When my grandfather passed away, I felt like it had been a long time coming. Don't get me wrong, it was still a loss, but it wasn't something that shocked anyone. He was an elderly man, with his mind mostly gone, living alone in a house nearly 30 miles away from the nearest town. When the news arrived that he had been found in his home, dead for at least 2 weeks, I felt sad, but not entirely surprised. Fresh out of the University of Oklahoma with a liberal arts degree, I debated moving into his old house for a while. My parents didn't want it, and they weren't keen on renting it out either. Besides, it was much nicer than anything I could afford anytime soon. By April of that year, I finally pushed past my hesitation and moved in. My brother Ben decided to join me, having just gone through a rough breakup with his live-in girlfriend and needing somewhere to crash for a few months while he sorted things out. The house was big enough that it felt wrong to say no. Before our grandfather's mind started to fade, he had quite a bit of money. I didn't see him much while growing up, since he lived a few hundred miles south of us in eastern Texas. Still, I can remember the gifts he sent us for Christmas and birthdays and things like that. They were usually a lot nicer than what our parents could afford. He even helped out when I got my first car, agreeing to cover half the cost as long as it wasn't some rice burner, as he liked to say. No one would claim he was a perfect old man, or that we didn't have our disagreements, but he did help me get a brand new F-150, so it was clear he cared about us. This house felt like one last birthday present, I thought when I moved in. Sure, it came a few months early and in a bit of an inconvenient location, but it didn't really need much work. The upstairs bedroom had been completely cleared out by the police from Silver Springs, for reasons I preferred not to think about. But aside from that, it was in great shape. Our first night there, Ben and I only brought in our mattresses, a TV, and my old Xbox 360. We stayed up late just messing around because neither of us really felt like going to bed. After we finished playing the one racing game we could both agree on, we talked for a while about how life had been since we left home. The one topic we completely avoided was why our grandpa had died. Even with his issues, he had been a brilliant man, the head of a software company before he retired. It was only in the last few months that signs of senility began to show, and he declined quickly. A month before the end, he had called home, talking about his past and claiming he saw the devil standing under an apple tree when he was a child. After that, he stopped contacting us, or anyone else for that matter. He died from dehydration after apparently flipping every circuit in the house and cutting off the water supply. To say the least, it was unsettling to think about. Maybe I dreamed about him that first night. Maybe I didn't. I'm not sure anymore. What I do know is that I definitely dreamed about him several nights after that. In those dreams, he shifted from the old man I remembered into a dried-up corpse right before my eyes. It was like watching someone turn into a mummy. I'm sure it was tied to my own anxieties at the time, since I had just gotten over a mild cancer scare. I've always been prone to worrying, and discovering a strange lump on my leg didn't help my nerves. The next day, whether I had one of those dreams or not, we began bringing in more of our belongings. I didn't have much, having lived in a dorm for 4 years. Ben hauled in 2 computers, several bookshelves full of paperbacks, and for some reason, a treadmill. By the end of it, it looked like he was the one moving in, and I was just the guest. Later that day, we went into town to grab food, a 12-pack of Pepsi and a 6-pack of Coors. It was that morning, upon arriving, that I first sensed something was a bit off about the house. We pulled into the driveway, got out of my brother's Mazda, and were halfway to the door before I realized for the first time that no birds were singing. Behind the house stretched an open field, extending a few hundred yards to the edge of the forest. Normally, I'd expect to hear some wildlife, but nothing stirred beyond the tree line. I pointed out the unsettling quiet to Ben, and he joked that maybe Slenderman had taken all the birds. As far as jokes go, it was weaker than usual. Ben had also noticed the silence was heavier than it had been the day before. That night we stayed up, but Ben dove into one of his college textbooks on European democracy, leaving me to play Halo alone. After Ben had gone to bed in his own room, I turned off the game's volume and listened for the sound of crickets. There was nothing. I opened the window and looked out over the field, where fireflies should have been lighting up the night this time of year. But there was only darkness, and the stars met my searching gaze. That night, I went to bed, and I know I had one of the dreams. The next few weeks were fine. We got everything set up, cleaned out whatever needed cleaning around the house, and found a box of Grandpa's old belongings in the attic. Most of it was from his time in Japan during World War II, including a collection of medals. One of them was a Purple Heart. I loved that old man, even if I don't always sound like it. I had a strange way of showing it sometimes, but I cared about him deeply. It was mid-May when the real problems began. I remember Ben saying he thought he saw an albino deer in the woods. He sat on the back porch that evening, staring at the forest, but nothing stirred. As the sun set, a breeze drifted in from the southeast, blowing in from the distant Gulf of Mexico. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something in the underbrush, but it didn't look like a deer. I convinced Ben to come inside with me, and that night I slept restlessly. Whatever I'd seen lingered in my mind, though I couldn't yet place what it was. The next morning, we had to make another trip into town. This time, it wasn't for supplies, but to see some movie that Ben had been raving about for weeks. Because of that, we got home late that night. It was waiting for us in the driveway. I only caught a glimpse before the lights in my truck flickered out, but I could have drawn police sketches of that thing for the rest of my life. It resembled a human, but it stood nearly 8 feet tall. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones and muscle, giving it a lean look, both emaciated and somehow terrifyingly strong. The hair on its head was thin and scraggly, and its eyes were empty black pits. I hadn't yet seen the claws, which were hidden by the front of my truck, but I could see its teeth. And they're what I remember most. Its mouth hung open like it was unhinged, packed full of knife-like teeth. When the lights went out, Ben glanced at me, and through the gloom, I could make out the pure terror on his face. The creature was still visible in the dark outside, a shadow darker than the night itself. We both stared, frozen, as if it hesitated to make a move. I had no idea what time it was, since I couldn't see my watch, and it probably wasn't working anyway. As the minutes dragged into what felt like hours, it became clear that this thing was standing there for a reason beyond just toying with us. Somehow it couldn't see us. When morning began to dawn red on the horizon behind the house, I feared its vision might improve, but it still just stood there. In the better light, I could see that Ben was crying. Tears streamed down his face as that thing stared at us, unmoving and hungry. I then remembered a movie I'd seen when I was younger, Jurassic Park. The T-Rex in that film just stood by when its prey didn't move, waiting for them to flinch, because it could only see movement. The real T-Rex may not have been like that, but with the light of day, it clicked that this thing probably was. That, I realized, was why my grandfather had died of dehydration in his own house. This thing had shut off the power. It had short-circuited the breaker, and then it simply waited him out. Higher, the sun rose in the sky. Ben and I sat alone in that truck with the watcher staring at us for nearly 4 more hours as the heat inside the truck began to climb. Without power, the air conditioner wouldn't run, and the electric windows wouldn't roll down. Not that I would have trusted them anyway. It was 11 o'clock in the morning when Ben looked at me, shook his head, and cracked the door slightly. I stared in wide-eyed terror, but Ben turned toward the door. Slowly, he creaked it open and stepped outside. I watched as he closed the door, and the thing turned its head toward him. Still, it didn't quite seem to know where he was. Ben walked forward, every movement slow and careful. He was less than 3 feet from the thing when it sensed just enough motion to turn its head toward him. I watched as he walked past it, the thing unmoving and almost blind. I really thought Ben was going to make it to the house. Then he stepped on a twig. It took all I had not to scream as I watched the thing cross the distance in a single leap, knocking him to the ground. Its claws appeared then, fierce obsidian blades. Ben screamed, and I heard that thing howl like a wolf from hell. It was evening before I became aware of the world again. When I did, I realized something. My truck was running. I threw it into reverse as fast as I could, backing out of the long driveway from my grandfather's house. 2 years later, everyone thinks he was killed by a bear. They keep telling me what I saw wasn't real, that I just mistook a common animal for a monster. But I'll always remember the moment that thing looked back at me one last time. I don't think I'll ever forget what lives behind that line of trees.